I overheard my wife mocking my salary. She didn't know I owned her company's entire future. The first time I heard her say it, I was standing in the hallway outside our bedroom with a glass of water in my hand and my socks on the hardwood floor, and the door open just wide enough for every word to reach me with perfect, undeniable clarity. She was on the phone with her sister Nadine. It was a Tuesday night in March. The house was supposed to be quiet. I had come upstairs to bring her water because she had been on calls all evening, and I knew she forgot to drink anything when she was working, and I had been the kind of husband who noticed that for 12 years without once being asked to. Her voice was light, casual, the tone people use when they are saying something they have said many times before and no longer consider it worth weighing. Girl, you know Derek is not exactly bringing in the big numbers. I love him, but let us be honest. $47,000. That is what he makes. That is the whole thing. I have interns who negotiate harder than that. She laughed. Nadine laughed. The sound carried through the door and down the hallway and into the center of my chest, where it sat like a stone dropped into a well, falling and never quite hitting the bottom. I stood there with the glass of water in my hand. I did not move. I did not breathe loudly. I did not open the door or close it or set the glass down on the hallway table or do anything at all except stand perfectly still and let the full weight of what I had just heard settle into my body the way cold settles into a house when the furnace stops working, slowly, completely, from every direction at once. She kept talking. I could hear the smile in her voice, the ease of it, the way it carried no guilt and no hesitation, and no awareness that the man she was describing was 6 feet away holding a glass of water he had brought upstairs for no reason other than that he loved her and had always paid attention. I set the glass on the hallway table. I walked downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall above the stove ticked the way it always ticked, a sound I had heard 10,000 times and never once noticed until that moment, when every small sound in the house became suddenly, painfully specific, as though the world had increased its resolution just to make sure I felt everything at full clarity. My name is Derek Hollis. I am 43 years old. I was born and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois, in a neighborhood where the streetlights worked on some blocks and not on others, and where success was measured not in dollars, but in whether you made it out with your dignity still recognizable. My mother, Pauline, worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, a day shift at a packaging facility in Sauget, and an evening shift doing medical billing from a folding table in our kitchen, with a calculator and a lamp and a focus so intense that I learned at a very young age not to interrupt her unless the house was on fire. My father, Thomas, was a welder who worked union jobs across the river in St. Louis proper. He left the house at 5:30 every morning and came home at 6 every evening with burns on his forearms and a quiet pride in his posture that I did not fully understand until I was old enough to know what it cost. They raised me to believe in 3 things: show up, do the work, and never ever let someone else's opinion of your value replace your own. I held on to that. For 43 years I held on to that. But holding on to something and being tested on it are 2 different experiences. And that Tuesday in March was the test I did not know was coming. I met Genevieve in 2010 at a conference in downtown Chicago. She was presenting on brand strategy for mid-market consumer companies. She was 29, confident, sharp, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately became the thing everyone else oriented around. Her slides were clean. Her data was tight. Her delivery had the precision of someone who had rehearsed not because she was nervous, but because she believed preparation was a form of respect for the people listening. I was in the audience. I was 32. I worked as a procurement specialist for a regional food distribution company called Hargrove & Sons, based out of Collinsville, Illinois. I made $44,000 a year. I wore a sport coat I had bought at a Kohl's clearance sale and shoes I had resoled twice. I sat in the 3rd row and took notes on a legal pad because I had not yet bought a laptop, and did not see the point of pretending I had. After her presentation, I waited until the crowd thinned and walked up to her. I told her the case study she had used, a turnaround strategy for a struggling pet food brand, had a flaw in the margin analysis that would show up in year 2 if the supplier contracts were not renegotiated. She looked at me. She did not smile. She did not dismiss me. She tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when something unexpected has just landed close enough to be interesting. "You are in procurement," she said. It was not a question. "I am," I said. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You are the first person today who actually read the numbers instead of just looking at the pictures." We had dinner that night at a small Italian place on Michigan Avenue. She ordered in a way that suggested she had eaten at restaurants like this many times. I ordered in a way that suggested I was reading the menu carefully because I intended to pay and needed to know what I was committing to. She noticed. She did not say anything about it. That was the first thing I loved about her, the things she chose not to say. We were married in 2012. Small ceremony. Her family filled most of the room. Her mother, Loretta, was a retired marketing executive who wore silk scarves and had opinions about everything, and shared them with the cheerful, relentless energy of a woman who believed silence was a waste of good oxygen. Her sister, Nadine, was a corporate attorney in Atlanta, who called every Sunday and who, I would learn over the years, served as both Genevieve's closest confidant and the echo chamber in which every opinion Genevieve already held was amplified, validated, and returned to her with interest. My mother came. She wore a blue dress she had bought for the occasion and sat in the front row and held my father's photograph in her lap because he had passed 2 years earlier, and she wanted him to be there. She did not cry. She smiled. She smiled the way she did everything, with the full weight of a woman who had earned every moment she was living and did not intend to waste a single one of them on grief when joy was available. We moved to a townhouse in Clayton, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis with good schools and quiet streets and the particular manicured stillness of a community that has decided comfort is its highest value. Genevieve loved the house. She loved the neighborhood. She loved the proximity to her office downtown. I loved that she was happy. Those two things felt like the same thing for a long time. They were not, but I did not have the language for the difference yet, and by the time I did, the house had become a fact, and the mortgage had become a structure. And structures are harder to walk away from than feelings, because structures have paperwork. Genevieve had founded her company, Lumino Strategy Group, in 2009, a year before we met. It was a brand consulting firm that worked with mid-market consumer companies, the kind of businesses that were too big to wing it and too small to hire McKinsey. By the time we married, Luminos had 4 employees and revenue just under $300,000. By 2018, it had grown to 14 employees and revenue of $1.2 million. By the night she mocked my salary to her sister, it had 22 employees and was billing just over $2.8 million annually. I was proud of her. I need to say that clearly and without reservation. I was proud of what she built. I understood the hours, the risk, the particular exhaustion of being a Black woman building a company in a space that did not always make room. I respected it. I supported it. For 12 years, I was the person who handled everything she did not have time to handle. The grocery runs, the dry cleaning, the mortgage payments timed to the day, the Sunday meal prep that kept the week from collapsing, the calls to the plumber and the electrician and the accountant, the invisible infrastructure of a life that allowed her to walk into rooms and be extraordinary. And I did all of it on $47,000 a year. I want to pause here, not for dramatic effect, but because this number, $47,000, is the number that lived at the center of everything that happened next, and it deserves to be understood not as a figure on a pay stub, but as a frame that was placed around me by the people I loved, a frame I did not choose and did not build, and that shrank a little more each year until I could barely move inside it. Psychologists call this financial identity reduction, the process by which a person's income becomes the primary lens through which their worth is perceived by those closest to them. It is not always hostile. Often it is casual, ambient, woven so deeply into the fabric of daily interaction that the person being reduced does not recognize the pattern until the pattern has become the entire garment. Derek was not being attacked. He was being categorized, and the category was too small for what he actually was. What Genevieve did not know, what Nadine did not know, What no one in my life except two people on this earth knew was that my salary at Hargrove & Sons was the smallest and least significant financial fact about me. I need to go back to 2014. 2 years into our marriage, I received a phone call from a man named Silas Drummond. Silas was 71 years old. He had been my father's closest friend for over 40 years. They had welded together on the same crew for a decade before Silas moved into commercial real estate and spent the next 30 years quietly buying, renovating, and holding small commercial properties across the greater St. Louis area. Strip malls, office parks, a handful of warehouse spaces along the river in North County. Silas had no children. His wife, Mabel, had passed in 2011. He was, by the time he called me, a man of considerable means and almost no one left to share them with. He called me on a Saturday afternoon. I was in the garage changing the oil on Genevieve's car because the dealership wanted $90 to do it and I knew how to do it myself and saw no reason to pay someone for a skill I already had. "Your father was the most honest man I ever worked with," Silas said. His voice was deep and slow, the voice of a man who had spent 7 decades in the Midwest and had absorbed its rhythms completely. "He would not have wanted me to give you anything. He would have wanted me to teach you something. So I am going to do both, and you are going to have to live with the contradiction." Over the next 3 months, Silas taught me the fundamentals of commercial real estate investment, not the theory, the practice, how to read a lease, how to evaluate a cap rate, how to negotiate with contractors who assumed a younger man meant a less serious buyer, how to identify a property that was undervalued not because the market had missed it, but because the market was not paying attention to the neighborhoods where the value actually lived. In September 2014, Silas sold me my first property, a small commercial building on Natural Bridge Avenue in North St. Louis County. 3 units, 2 tenants, 1 vacancy, purchase price, $85,000. He financed it himself at 2% interest because, he said, the banks will get their share eventually. "I would rather your first lesson not include learning how to be afraid of a loan officer." I made the payments from a separate checking account I opened at a credit union in Belleville, Illinois, 15 miles from our house in Clayton. The account was in my name only. I did not hide it. I simply did not mention it. The way you do not mention a garden you are planting in a yard no one else walks through. It was mine. It was quiet. It was the first thing I had built that existed entirely outside the frame other people had placed around me. Over the next 4 years, Silas guided me through 3 more acquisitions: a duplex commercial space in Pine Lawn, a small office building in Jennings, a warehouse property near the Chain of Rocks Bridge that I bought for $60,000 from an estate sale, and that, after 12 months of renovation, I managed myself on weekends and evenings, began generating $4,000 a month in rental income. Silas died in the spring of 2018. Peacefully, at home, in the leather recliner he had owned for 20 years and refused to replace because, he said, "The chair knows my shape, and I'm not starting over at this age." His will left me 3 additional properties, 2 small retail spaces in Florissant, and a mixed-use building in University City that anchored the entire eastern end of a block that was, at the time, beginning to show the early signs of the kind of revitalization that turns $60,000 properties into $600,000 properties, if you are patient enough and early enough and willing to hold, while everyone else is still deciding whether the neighborhood is worth betting on. I held. I always held. That was the one thing I knew how to do better than anyone: hold steady when the people around me were moving fast and loud and certain. I held the way my father held a welding torch, with patience and precision and the absolute unshakable understanding that the thing being built was more important than the speed at which it was being built. By the night Genevieve mocked my salary, my real estate portfolio was valued at just over $3.4 million. Annual rental income across all properties exceeded $280,000. The funds were managed through a holding company called Drummond Capital LLC, named for Silas, registered in Illinois, administered by a property management firm I had hired in 2019, and held in a trust whose sole trustee was my mother, Pauline Hollis, who understood exactly what she was holding and why, and who had never once in all the years since Silas first called me on that Saturday afternoon asked me a single question about when I intended to tell my wife. She did not ask because she already knew the answer. The answer was not yet. The answer was not until I know it is safe. The answer was the same answer that every person gives who has been quietly and systematically taught by the people closest to them that their value is a number on a pay stub, and that the number is not high enough, and that everything they do outside that number is invisible. My mother understood because she had lived it. 30 years of 2 jobs and a folding table and a calculator and a lamp, and a woman whose worth was measured by everyone around her in dollars, and never once in the things she made possible with those dollars. She understood the architecture of invisibility, because she had been its architect and its resident and its only maintenance crew for most of her adult life. Psychologists describe this as strategic financial compartmentalization, the deliberate separation of financial identity from relational identity, as a protective response to sustained emotional devaluation. It is not dishonesty in the clinical sense. It is the construction of a space where the self can exist without being measured, assessed, or reduced. It is what people build when the people who are supposed to see them have made it clear, through 1,000 small signals over 1,000 ordinary days, that they are only willing to look at one dimension. Now, the part where everything begins to converge. In January of the year, everything changed. Genevieve came home from work and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a look on her face I had not seen before. Not stress exactly. Something beneath stress. Something structural. Luminos was growing. That was the problem. Not the fact of the growth, but the shape of it. She had landed 2 major contracts in the fall, a rebranding engagement with a regional grocery chain, and a brand strategy overhaul for a consumer electronics company expanding into the Midwest. Together, the contracts were worth just over $1.1 million. They would nearly double the company's annual revenue, but the contracts required capital, upfront investment in talent, technology, research infrastructure. Luminos needed to hire 6 new people immediately. It needed new project management software. It needed a physical office expansion because the current space on Olive Boulevard could not hold the team she was building. She needed, by her own estimate, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 in working capital within 60 days. She had gone to 3 banks. All 3 had declined, not because the business was weak, but because the growth was too fast and the cash reserves were too thin, and the contracts, while signed, had payment structures that would not deliver revenue for another 4 to 6 months. The banks saw risk. Genevieve saw the future. Neither was wrong. They were simply looking at different things. She sat at the kitchen table and told me all of this. I listened the way I always listened, fully, carefully, without interrupting, because I had learned a long time ago that Genevieve did not want me to solve her problems. She wanted me to hear them. The solving she would do herself, or so she believed. I asked her one question. What happens if you do not get the capital in time? She looked at me. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been asked a question she has already answered for herself, many times in private, and does not enjoy hearing it spoken aloud. Then I lose both contracts, she said. The grocery chain has a competing bid from a firm in Chicago. If I cannot staff up, they will walk. And if they walk, the electronics company will hear about it, because this industry is small and reputation moves faster than revenue. And then Luminos is back to where it was 3 years ago. Except now I have the overhead of a company twice that size and no way to sustain it. She closed her laptop. She rubbed her eyes. She looked for a moment, not like a CEO or a strategist, or the woman whose confidence reorganized every room she entered, but like a person who was very tired and very afraid, and who did not have anyone to say that to, except the man she had been mocking to her sister 6 weeks earlier. I sat with that. I sat with the irony of it and the sadness of it and the strange, heavy tenderness of loving someone who does not know what you are holding for them. I sat with it the way I sat with everything, quietly, completely, without letting it change the expression on my face. That night I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to Genevieve's breathing and thought about Silas, about my father, about the properties I owned and the income they generated and the trust that held them and the mother who guarded them. I thought about $47,000 and $2.8 million and $3.4 million, and the strange, vertiginous math of a marriage in which one person's visible number was treated as the whole story, while the other numbers, the real numbers, sat in silence, behind a door no one had ever thought to open. I did not sleep that night. I made a decision instead. The next morning I drove to Belleville. I sat in my mother's kitchen, the same kitchen where I had done homework as a child while she worked the billing at her folding table, the same kitchen where she had handed me my father's photograph the morning of my wedding and said, "He would have told you to choose someone who sees you. I hope you have." I told her everything: the mocking, the salary conversation, the financial crisis at Luminos, the banks declining, the contracts at risk. She listened the way she always listened, with her hands folded on the table and her eyes steady, and her posture carrying the full authority of a woman who had survived every kind of weather Illinois could produce and had not once complained about the temperature. When I finished, she said one thing: "What are you going to do with what you know? Not what are you going to do about the marriage. Not what are you going to do about the money. What are you going to do with what you know?" The question was precise, surgical. It separated the knowledge from the emotion and asked me to deal with the knowledge first, because the emotion would still be there when I was finished, and the knowledge might not wait. I told her my plan. She listened. She nodded once. She made me coffee. She did not try to talk me out of it or into it. She simply let me be a grown man making a grown decision in her kitchen, which was, I understood, the greatest form of respect she knew how to give. I drove from Belleville to the law office of a man named Franklin Yates in downtown St. Louis. Franklin was the attorney who had helped me structure Drummond Capital. He was 64, methodical, and allergic to ambiguity. He wore bow ties and kept a jar of butterscotch candies on his desk that he never offered to anyone, but that disappeared at a rate that suggested he was eating them steadily throughout every meeting. I told Franklin what I wanted to do. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them slowly. He put them back on. "You understand what this means," he said. "If you do this, you become the single largest private creditor to your wife's company. You will hold the financial instrument that determines whether Luminos survives or contracts. You will have leverage that she does not know you have, in a marriage where she does not know you have anything at all." I told him I understood. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "I have been practicing law for 38 years. I have seen people use money as a weapon more times than I can count. That is not what I am hearing from you. What I am hearing is a man who wants to save something without being seen saving it. And I want to be very clear with you about one thing, Derek. The not being seen part is the part that will cost you the most." I told him I understood that too. He nodded. He opened a drawer. He took out a butterscotch candy. He unwrapped it slowly and placed it in his mouth and began drafting the documents. Within 2 weeks, Franklin had structured a private lending arrangement through Drummond Capital LLC. The terms were straightforward. Drummond Capital would extend a $450,000 line of credit to Luminos Strategy Group at 4% interest, repayable over 36 months, secured against Luminos revenue projections and accounts receivable. The lending entity would be identified on all documents as Drummond Capital LLC, with no reference to my name anywhere in the paperwork. The point of contact for all communications would be Franklin's office. The offer was delivered to Luminos through a commercial broker Genevieve had been working with, a man named Ian Prescott, who operated out of the Central West End, and who had a reputation for connecting small and mid-sized businesses with private capital sources. Ian did not know who was behind Drummond Capital. Franklin had structured the introduction so that it would appear to be one of several options Ian was presenting. It was, in fact, the only option that was real. The others were legitimate, but would not move fast enough for her timeline. Genevieve took the deal. She told me about it at dinner 3 days later. She was smiling, not the polished, professional smile she used in meetings. A real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there and makes the whole face look younger and softer, and more like the woman I had fallen in love with 13 years earlier at a conference in Chicago, where she had been the smartest person in the room, and I had been the only one who noticed the flaw in her numbers, and she had been the only one who cared. "We got the funding," she said. "A private lender. The terms are incredible. 4%, 36 months. No equity stake. Ian found them. I do not even know who is behind it, but honestly, I do not care right now. This saves everything, Derek. This keeps Luminos alive. I said that is wonderful. I said I was proud of her. I said she deserved it. All of those things were true. I was proud of her. She did deserve it. She had built something real and the funding would let her keep building. The fact that the money was mine did not change any of that. It did not make her achievement smaller or my contribution larger. It simply meant that the invisible man she had been married to for 12 years had just done the most visible thing he had ever done, and she still could not see him. Psychologists call this the invisible benefactor paradox. When a person provides critical support anonymously to someone who has consistently undervalued them, the act creates a dual psychological burden. The benefactor experiences the satisfaction of having helped and the grief of remaining unseen in the same moment. The recipient experiences relief without gratitude, not because they are ungrateful, but because gratitude requires a target, and they do not know where to aim it. Both people are honest. Both people are incomplete. And the space between them, the space where recognition should live, remains empty. The months that followed were the strangest of my marriage. Luminos thrived. The grocery chain contract launched on schedule. The electronics company engagement exceeded projections. Genevieve hired 8 new people. She signed a lease on a larger office space on Maryland Avenue in the Central West End, a beautiful old building with exposed brick and tall windows that let in the kind of afternoon light that makes everyone in the room look like they are doing important work, which, to be fair, they were. She was happy, genuinely, visibly, structurally happy in a way I had not seen in years. The anxiety that had lived behind her eyes for so long I had stopped noticing it was gone. In its place was the particular confidence of a woman who had faced the edge and stepped back and was now standing on solid ground, and believed that the ground had been provided by the universe or by Ian Prescott, or by the sheer force of her own determination. She did not know the ground was me. She did not know that every dollar keeping her company alive had been earned in properties across North County and Florissant and University City by a man who made $47,000 a year at his day job, and who came home every night and took out the recycling and listened to her talk about revenue projections and cap rates and client acquisition strategies and never once said, "I know. I know about all of this. I have been doing it too. I have been doing it longer than you. I have been doing it in the dark while you slept and while your sister laughed and while your mother asked me at every holiday if I had considered going back to school." I did not say it because saying it would have changed everything, and I was not yet sure that everything needed to change. I was still hoping in the quiet, stubborn, irrational way that people hope when they have been loving someone for a very long time, that she would look at me one day and see what was already there. That the seeing would come first, that I would not have to build a monument to my own worth and stand next to it and point and say, "Look." I wanted her to look on her own. I wanted the looking to be her idea. It was not her idea. The second time I heard her mock my salary, it was worse. Not because the words were crueler, but because the context was wider. She was not on the phone with Nadine. She was at a dinner party at our house, standing in the kitchen with 3 women I recognized as colleagues and one I did not. A tall woman with sharp cheekbones and an expensive watch who laughed at everything Genevieve said approximately half a second before it was funny. I was in the living room. The kitchen door was open. The women were drinking wine and their voices had reached that particular volume that arrives when people have had enough to stop performing and not enough to stop being coherent. Genevieve's voice. Clear, bright, the voice of a woman holding court. Derek is a sweetheart, he really is. But the man has been at the same company for 11 years, making basically the same salary, and I do not understand that. I could never. I would rather fail trying to build something than succeed at being ordinary. Laughter. The tall woman with the watch. "You are too much, Jen." Genevieve. Continuing. "I mean, I have never said this to him, obviously, but sometimes I look at him and I think, do you not want more? Do you not look around and see what other people are building and feel anything? Or is this really it for you? Is $47,000 the whole dream?" More laughter. Glasses clinking. The sound of people being entertained by a version of me that existed only in my wife's narrative. A flat, uncomplicated character in a story she was telling to make herself feel larger by comparison. I was standing in the living room holding a tray of appetizers I had made. Bruschetta with roasted tomatoes and fresh basil from the garden I maintained in the backyard. A garden no one ever commented on, but that produced enough basil and tomatoes and peppers each summer to stock the kitchen for months. I had been about to walk in and offer them food. I had been about to be the quiet, steady, generous man I had always been in that house. I set the tray down on the coffee table. I walked to the back door. I went outside. I stood in the yard in the March cold and looked at the garden, which was dormant now, just dark soil and the skeletal remains of last year's tomato stakes, and I breathed. In and out. Slowly. The way my father used to breathe after a long day, standing on the porch of our apartment in East St. Louis looking at the street, not seeing anything in particular, just letting the air remind him that he was still here, and that still here was enough. I stood in that yard for 7 minutes. I know because I counted my breaths and I breathe approximately 8 times per minute when I am standing still and trying not to feel something that wants very much to be felt. Then I went back inside. I picked up the tray. I walked into the kitchen. I smiled. I offered bruschetta. The women thanked me. Women. Genevieve touched my shoulder briefly. The automatic, reflexive touch of a woman acknowledging the presence of a person she has already dismissed in the same room. The same gesture. The same breath. I went upstairs. I closed the guest room door. I sat on the bed, and I made a decision that had been building for 6 weeks and had finally, in the space of those 7 minutes in the cold yard, arrived at its full and final shape. I was done being invisible, not vengefully, not explosively. I was simply done. Done standing in hallways hearing my worth reduced to a number. Done carrying the infrastructure of a life that did not acknowledge me as a load-bearing wall. Done hoping she would see me without being shown what she was looking at. I was not going to destroy anything. I was not going to reveal anything in anger or orchestrate a confrontation or engineer a dramatic collapse. I was going to do what I had always done. I was going to build, quietly, carefully, and this time, when the building was finished, I was going to make sure that every person who had ever measured me by my salary understood, completely and irreversibly, that they had been measuring the wrong thing. The next morning I called Franklin Yates. I told him I wanted a full audit of the Drummond Capital lending arrangement with Luminos. Every payment, every interest calculation, every clause. I wanted it reviewed, updated, and prepared for disclosure. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I knew he would ask. Disclosure to whom? To my wife, I said. But not yet. When I am ready. And on terms I choose. He paused. I could hear him unwrapping a butterscotch candy. He placed it in his mouth. He said, I will have everything ready within 2 weeks. The next 4 months moved with the strange, compressed intensity of a life being reorganized from the inside. On the surface, nothing changed. I went to work at Hargrove, I came home, I made dinner, I maintained the garden. I listened to Genevieve talk about Luminos and nodded and asked questions and offered the steady, unspectacular support I had always offered. Beneath the surface, I was building the architecture of a conversation I intended to have one time and one time only. I hired a forensic accountant named Denise Holbrook to prepare a comprehensive valuation of the Drummond Capital portfolio. Total verified assets across all properties, including appreciation, rental income, and equity, came to $3.7 million. The Luminos line of credit, including accrued interest, stood at $468,000. Combined, my net worth exceeded $4 million. I also retained a family law attorney named Claudia Reeves, a woman in her late 50s who worked out of an office in University City and who had the particular energy of someone who had spent decades translating pain into procedure and had learned to do it without losing the humanity underneath. I sat in her office and told her everything: the marriage, the mocking, the salary conversations, the anonymous lending arrangement, the properties, the trust, all of it. When I finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said something I did not expect. You love her? I said yes. She nodded. She wrote something on her pad. She said, "That makes this harder. It also makes it more important. Because what you are describing is not a broken marriage. It is an unbalanced one. And unbalanced things do not need to be destroyed. They need to be corrected. The question is whether she is capable of standing on level ground with you, or whether she needs you to be smaller in order to feel tall." That question lived in me for weeks. I carried it to work and back. I carried it to the garden. I carried it to my mother's kitchen table where I sat one Sunday afternoon while she made sweet potato pie and did not ask me a single question because she could see the answer forming in my face and knew that some answers need time to finish writing themselves. The moment arrived in July. Genevieve had been in a difficult stretch. One of the Luminos contracts had hit a delay. A key employee had resigned. The lending payment to Drummond Capital was coming due, and she was, for the first time since receiving the funding, worried about cash flow. She came home on a Thursday evening and sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and stared at the numbers, the way a person stares at something they are trying to make change through sheer force of attention. I sat across from her. I had a glass of water in front of me, the same kind of glass, the same table, the same kitchen where I had stood in the dark 6 months earlier, and listened to the refrigerator hum and let my life rearrange itself inside me. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. She looked up. Her face had the distracted, half-present expression of a woman who was expecting me to ask about dinner plans or the lawn or something equally manageable. I opened a folder I had brought downstairs. Inside it, the complete Drummond Capital documentation, the property portfolio, the trust structure, the lending agreement, the forensic accounting report, 47 pages. I placed it on the table between us. "This is Drummond Capital," I said. "The company that funded Luminos 6 months ago. The private lender that Ian Prescott introduced you to. The entity that provided $450,000 at 4% interest and saved your company from losing both major contracts." She looked at the folder. She looked at me. The distraction was gone. Something else was arriving, not understanding yet, but the awareness that understanding was about to be required. "Drummond Capital is mine," I said. "I own it. I have owned it since 2014. It is named after Silas Drummond, my father's best friend, who taught me commercial real estate and left me 3 properties when he died. I now own 7 properties across the St. Louis metro area. The portfolio is worth $3.7 million. The annual rental income exceeds $280,000. The trust is in my mother's name. The holding company is registered in Illinois. And the $450,000 that is keeping Luminos alive right now came from me, from Derek, from the man who makes $47,000 a year." I said that last sentence slowly, not with cruelty, with precision, because I needed every word to land exactly where I aimed it. The kitchen was silent. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The overhead light, which did not buzz in this house the way it did in some other house in some other story, cast its steady, even glow on the table and the folder and the woman sitting across from me whose face was undergoing a transformation I had never seen before. She did not speak for a long time. She looked at the folder. She reached out and opened it. She turned pages. She read numbers. She looked at property addresses she recognized because she had driven past them. We had driven past them together, and she had never once considered that the man in the passenger seat owned the buildings outside the window. She looked at the lending agreement. She saw the terms. She saw the interest rate. She saw the structure that had been designed not to extract maximum value but to provide maximum support at minimum cost. She saw the 4% interest rate that any commercial lender would have set at 8 or 9 or 12, and understood in that moment that the generosity of the terms was not a business decision. It was a love letter written in the only language she had ever respected. She closed the folder. She placed both hands flat on the table. She looked at me. Her eyes were full. Not crying. Full. The particular fullness of a woman who has just received too much information to process and too much truth to deflect, and who is, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, sitting in a room with no performance available, no strategy applicable, no framework sufficient to organize what she is feeling into something she can control. "How long?" she said. Her voice was thin, not weak, thin, the way metal sounds when it is being stretched to the limit of what it can hold. "Since 2014, I said. 9 years. She closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a long time. I watched her face. I watched the muscles around her jaw. I watched her hands on the table, the fingers that had typed business plans and signed contracts and pointed at slides and held wine glasses and touched my shoulder in kitchens full of people she was performing for. And never once, not once in 12 years, reached across a table like this one and taken my hand because she wanted to know what I was holding. She opened her eyes. "I heard you," I said. "In the hallway. In March. You were on the phone with Nadine. You said I make $47,000 and that is the whole thing. You said you have interns who negotiate harder than that." She flinched, a full-body flinch, the kind that starts in the shoulders and moves through the torso and ends in the hands, which she pulled off the table and placed in her lap as though trying to hide them from me or from herself. "I heard you at the dinner party too," I said. "In the kitchen. With your colleagues. You said you look at me and wonder if this is really it for me. If $47,000 is the whole dream." She pressed her lips together. The fullness in her eyes spilled. One tear on the left side, then the right. She did not wipe them. She let them fall. She let them land on the table and on the folder and on the documents that contained the full, verified, 47-page truth of who I actually was. I did not say those things to hurt her. I said them because they were facts, and facts are what I have always believed in more than feelings, because facts do not change when someone leaves the room and feelings do. "Derek," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am not finished," I said. And I said it gently, not harshly, gently, because the thing I was about to say was the hardest thing I had ever said in my life, and I needed it to arrive without violence so that she could hear it clearly enough to decide what to do with it. "I have loved you for 13 years, I said. I have supported you in every way I know how. I have carried the invisible parts of this life without complaint and without recognition, and without resentment for most of that time. But I heard what you said. I heard the way you talk about me when you think I am not listening. And I need you to understand something. The man you have been describing to your sister and your colleagues and yourself does not exist. He is a fiction you built because the fiction was more comfortable than the reality. The reality is that you married a man who builds things in the dark and does not need anyone to watch. The reality is that the man you have been pitying funded your company's survival and never said a word. And the reality is that I cannot stay in a marriage where the person I love the most is the person who sees me the least. The kitchen held everything. The silence and the tears and the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock and the steady even light, and two people sitting on opposite sides of a table that had never felt wider. She reached across the table. She put her hand on the folder. Not on my hand. On the folder. On the evidence. As though she needed to touch the proof before she could believe what she was hearing from the man she had slept next to for 4,380 nights and never once asked what he was dreaming. "I did not know," she said. "I know," I said. "Why did you not tell me?" I looked at her. I looked at the woman I had loved for 13 years and who had reduced me to a number, and who had laughed about that number with her sister, and who had told a room full of colleagues that my dreams were small, and who was now sitting in front of the documented proof that I had quietly and completely financed the survival of everything she had built, and who was asking me, with tears on her face and her hand on the folder, why I had not told her. "Because you never made it safe to tell you," I said. "Every time your mother asked me about going back to school, you did not correct her. Every time Terrence made a comment about my salary, you changed the subject instead of changing the conversation. Every time Nadine called and you talked about money and ambition and drive, I was in the next room listening to the silence where my name should have been. You did not make space for me to be more than what you had already decided I was. So I built the space myself. quietly, in the dark, the way I build everything. She sat with that. She sat with it the way I had sat with her words in the hallway 6 months earlier. Fully, painfully, without flinching. Because some truths are too heavy to hold at arm's length, and the only way to survive them is to let them rest on your chest and breathe underneath them until your lungs remember how to expand. "What happens now?" she said. "I do not know," I said. "But I know what does not happen. I do not go back to being invisible, not in this house, not in this marriage, not anywhere. If we continue with both of us visible, both of us seen, both of us measured by the full truth of who we are, not the convenient version, not the comfortable version, the full version." She nodded, slowly. The nod of a woman who is agreeing not because she has been convinced, but because she has been confronted with something she cannot argue with, and the inability to argue has left her standing in a place she has never stood before, the place where surrender and dignity coexist. I stood up. I picked up the folder. I walked to the doorway. "The lending terms stand," I said. 4%, 36 months. That was always the deal, and I am not changing it. Luminos will survive. Your company will thrive. That was never in question. I paused. The only thing that was ever in question was whether you could see the man who made it possible. And now you know. What you do with that is yours. I walked upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I heard the kitchen chair move below. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard the silence of a woman sitting alone with 47 pages and 13 years, and the full, irreversible, undeniable weight of everything she had missed, while she was busy being certain she had already seen it all. The months that followed were the hardest and most honest of our marriage. Genevieve began seeing a therapist. So did I. We sat in sessions together and apart and said things to each other that we had never said. Not because we had been unwilling, but because we had never built the room in which those things could be said safely. She called Nadine and told her. I do not know what she said. I do not know what words she used. I know that Nadine called me 2 weeks later and said, "Derek, I owe you an apology." And I know that her voice was different than I had ever heard it. Quieter, stripped of the performance, carrying the particular weight of a woman who has just discovered that the person she was laughing about was the person holding up the ceiling. Loretta came to the house for dinner in September. She sat at the table and looked at me and did not ask about business school. She asked about the garden. She asked about the tomatoes. She asked me to tell her about the properties, and I did, and she listened. And when I was finished, she said, "Thomas would have been proud of you." And she meant my father, who she had met only twice, but who she remembered because Thomas Hollis was the kind of man you remembered, not for what he said, but for the way he stood, steady and straight and certain of his own worth in a world that was not always certain of it for him. Genevieve and I did not fix everything. I want to be honest about that. Some things do not get fixed. Some things get replaced by something better that carries the scars of the original. We built a new marriage inside the old one, a marriage with more honesty and less performance, more silence that meant something and less noise that did not. She stopped mocking my salary because the salary stopped being the story. She started asking what I was working on. She started coming to the properties with me on Saturdays. She started seeing the buildings the way I saw them, not as investments but as evidence, proof that a man who had been told he was small had been building something large the entire time. I want to speak to you directly now. If you are listening to this and you are the person who builds in the dark, the person who carries the invisible weight, the person whose salary has become the only thing that people around you can see, the person who sits in a hallway or a kitchen or a parked car and hears the people they love reduce them to a number, and then gets up the next morning and makes coffee and goes to work and comes home and does it all again, because that is what they know how to do, and they do not yet have the language to explain why it hurts. I want to tell you something. Your worth is not a number on a pay stub. It is not a title on a business card. It is not the size of your house or the make of your car or the way someone introduces you at a dinner party. Your worth is the full, complicated, invisible, beautiful sum of every single thing you have ever built, carried, maintained, repaired, supported, protected, and held together when no one was watching and no one was counting, and no one thought to say thank you. That is your worth. It is vast. It is real, and it does not require anyone's recognition to exist. But here's the thing I learned standing in a march yard in the cold, breathing slowly, counting to 7 minutes while the woman I loved entertained her friends with stories about my inadequacy. You deserve to be seen. Not because your value depends on it, but because you have spent long enough being invisible, and the world owes you the experience of standing in your full height in your full light, and letting the people around you adjust their eyes. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Find the thing you built that no one acknowledged. The repair, the meal, the account, the side work, the garden, the late nights, the steady, unglamorous, uncinematic middle of your life where most of the real work happens. Look at it. Do not explain it. Do not defend it. Just look at it and know that it is yours and that it matters and that the people who could not see it were looking through the wrong window at the wrong wall in the wrong room of a house that was bigger than they ever imagined. You are not a number. You are the whole equation. And the math eventually always catches